"You're becoming a burden, Mom." Daniel didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't have to. The words settled over the Thanksgiving table heavier than the roasted turkey in the center, heavier than the crystal serving bowl filled with mashed potatoes I had whipped by hand that morning. I kept slicing the turkey breast the way I always did, thin and even, my wrist steady, my back straight, as if I hadn't just been gently repositioned in my own home. The dining room smelled of sage, butter, and cinnamon. The same smells that had filled this house every fourth Thursday of November for the past 32 years. The same table, the same china with the faint gold trim Edward insisted we register for back in 1978. I had polished every fork myself the night before, standing at the sink for nearly an hour, because traditions matter. At least, they used to. Olivia cleared her throat softly, the sound delicate but deliberate. "We just think it might be time to look at options," she added, her tone carefully wrapped in something that sounded like concern. "Maybe a nice community. Somewhere with activities. People your own age. People my own age. I am 72, not a relic. I still drive. I still balance my own checkbook. I still climb the narrow wooden stairs to the attic twice a year to bring down Christmas boxes." But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I placed 2 slices of turkey onto Daniel's plate and asked if he wanted white meat or dark. He hesitated, as if my question were inconvenient. "White is fine," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. I noticed then that I had been moved to the end of the table this year. Not at the head, where Edward once sat, and where I quietly assumed I would sit after he passed. "Just a small shift," they said when I asked earlier. "Better lighting for family photos." I hadn't argued. The candles flickered against the window, reflecting 3 faces and 1 empty chair. Edward's chair had remained empty since the heart attack 2 years ago, but tonight it felt different. Not just empty, replaced. Conversation drifted around me like I wasn't fully part of it. Renovation ideas, mortgage rates, property values in the neighborhood. "When we make changes to this place," Olivia said at one point, swirling cranberry sauce onto her plate, "we'll want something more modern. Open the kitchen. Take down that wall. That wall. The one Edward built with his own hands one summer when Daniel was 10. I felt the faintest tightening in my chest, not pain, just recognition. They were speaking about the house as if it were already theirs. I set down the carving knife and folded my napkin carefully into my lap. "When we make changes," I repeated softly, more to myself than to them. Daniel glanced at Olivia before answering. "It just makes sense to plan ahead. Plan ahead. For my absence. For my relocation. For a future that didn't include me at this table." The clock above the stove chimed 6 o'clock. I had woken at 5 this morning to start the pie crust from scratch. I measured flour the way my mother taught me, leveling it with the back of a butter knife. I basted the turkey every 30 minutes. I even polished the silver candlesticks Edward's mother gave us as a wedding gift. I did all of that in a house they were now quietly reassigning. I reached for my water glass, took a slow sip, and tasted nothing. "Mom," Daniel said again, softer this time, almost rehearsed. "We're just thinking about what's practical." Practical. Such a clean word. So efficient. I looked around the dining room at the framed photos lining the walls. Daniel at 8 years old holding a baseball glove nearly as big as his torso. Our 15th anniversary trip to Cape Cod. Edward standing proudly on the porch the day we paid off the mortgage. Practical doesn't build memories. Practical doesn't sand hardwood floors at midnight or plant maple trees that take 20 years to mature. I placed my hands flat against the tablecloth, feeling the familiar linen beneath my palms. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't remind them that I was the one who signed the insurance checks, who scheduled the roof repairs, who handled the property taxes every single year. Instead, I simply asked, in the calmest voice I could manage, "And whose house are we planning for exactly?" Silence followed. Not loud, not dramatic, just long enough to notice. Daniel shifted in his chair. Olivia's fork paused midair. Outside, a November wind brushed against the windows, dry leaves skimming across the porch Edward built with his own hands. I folded my napkin once more, slower this time, and realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to consider until that very moment. They believed I was temporary here, a guest in my own home, a burden waiting to be relocated. I let them continue passing dishes and discussing square footage and resale value. I nodded when appropriate. I even complimented Olivia's sweet potato casserole. But beneath the surface of polite Thanksgiving conversation, something quiet and steady began to settle inside me. Not anger, not even hurt. Clarity. And clarity, I've learned, is far more powerful than emotion. I washed the dishes after they finished eating, even though Olivia insisted they would handle it later. I have learned that later usually means tomorrow morning. And tomorrow morning usually means I will wake up to a sink full of cloudy water and plates crusted with dried gravy. The kitchen light hummed softly above me as I stood at the sink, sleeves rolled neatly to my forearms, warm water running over porcelain and silver. From the dining room, I could hear their voices, lower now, more relaxed without me sitting at the table. Daniel laughed once, a short, uneasy sound I had not heard in months. It just makes sense financially, he said. If we sell while the market is still high, we could clear at least 800,000. 800,000. I dried my hands slowly and placed the dish towel back on its hook. This house is not a line item. It is 2,600 square feet of birthdays and scraped knees and late-night talks at the kitchen counter. It is the faint pencil marks inside the pantry door where I measured Daniel's height every year until he turned 16 and told me to stop. I stepped into the hallway quietly, not to eavesdrop, but because the sound of my own absence seemed to invite honesty. And with Mom and assisted living, Olivia continued, her voice smooth. The expenses would be predictable. We would not have to worry about maintenance here. Maintenance. I glanced at the thermostat I replaced myself last spring. I remembered climbing a ladder in the garage to change the light fixture when Daniel said he was too busy with work. I remembered writing the property tax check 3 weeks ago, carefully reviewing the assessment like I do every year. Predictable expenses. I walked into the living room and pretended to adjust the framed photograph on the mantel. Edward's smile stared back at me, frozen in time. Taken the summer we refinished the deck together. Daniel noticed me then and cleared his throat. Mom, you should sit down. You have been on your feet all day. It sounded kind. It sounded attentive. It also sounded like something you say to someone fragile. I lowered myself into Edward's old armchair, the leather softened by decades of use, and folded my hands in my lap. Olivia sat across from me, legs crossed neatly, her expression composed. We are only trying to help, she said. It is a lot of house for one person. I nodded once. It is a lot of house. It is also fully paid for. I felt the weight of something else then, something I had not thought about in months. 6 weeks before Edward passed, he asked me to drive him to the attorney's office downtown. I remember the afternoon clearly. It was humid for September, nearly 80 degrees, and he insisted on wearing his navy blazer even though I told him it was too warm. Just in case, he said with a small smile. I waited in the reception area while he met privately with Mr. Harris, the same attorney who drafted our original will decades ago. When he came out, he looked tired but satisfied. He squeezed my hand in the parking lot and said, "Everything is handled." I did not press for details. I trusted him. Trust was the foundation of our marriage, and I never saw a reason to question it. Sitting in that armchair now, listening to my son outline square footage and resale projections, that memory returned with unusual clarity. Everything is handled. I stood up slowly and excused myself, saying I needed to check on the leftover pie. In truth, I walked down the hallway toward the small office at the back of the house. The one Edward used for paperwork. The one with the locked drawer in the bottom filing cabinet. My steps were steady, my breathing even. I did not feel panicked. I felt awake. Behind me, their conversation resumed, softer now, confident. They believed I was out of options. They believed practicality had already decided my future. I reached the office door and paused for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the brass knob. There is a difference between being alone and being powerless. Tonight, I was about to find out which one I truly was. I closed the office door behind me, not all the way, just enough to soften the sound of conversation drifting from the living room. The air in this room always feels different, quieter, as if the walls themselves understand discretion. Edward kept everything in careful order. The mahogany desk sits beneath the small window that looks out over the backyard, where the maple tree we planted 20 years ago now stands taller than the roofline. I walked to the filing cabinet against the far wall and knelt slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness in my knees that comes with 72 years of living, not fragility. The bottom drawer was locked, exactly as he left it. I reached into the top desk drawer and removed the small brass key taped neatly inside an envelope labeled household records. Edward believed in labeling everything. I slid the key into the lock and turned it gently. The clicks sounded louder than it should have. Inside were folders arranged alphabetically. Insurance, investments, mortgage, property. I pulled the property folder out and carried it to the desk, sitting down in his chair, the leather cool beneath my palms. My name was typed clearly across the most recent document. Margaret and Whitmore, sole owner. I read it once. Then again, slower. The transfer date was 6 months before Edward passed. The attorney's signature was there, along with a notarized seal. This was not a draft. This was final. Everything is handled. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. For 2 years I had lived in this house believing I shared it in memory. I had not known I held it entirely in law. I flipped through the remaining pages carefully. The deed was recorded with the county. The property taxes were issued solely in my name. There was no secondary owner. No contingency clause giving Daniel automatic rights. Edward had not left this ambiguous. He had not left room for interpretation. He had made a decision. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment, listening to the faint clatter of plates being stacked in the kitchen. Olivia's voice floated down the hallway. If we list in the spring, the yard will look better. The yard. The same yard where Daniel learned to ride his bicycle, wobbling across the grass while Edward jogged behind him, one hand steady on the seat. The same yard where we hosted graduation parties and 4th of July cookouts, where neighbors brought folding chairs and children chased each other with sparklers under careful supervision. I looked down again at the document in my hands. Ownership is a quiet kind of power. It does not raise its voice. It does not argue across a dinner table. It simply exists, solid and unmovable. I folded the papers carefully and returned them to their folder, then paused. Instead of placing them back into the drawer, I slid the entire folder into my sweater pocket. The fabric bulged slightly, but not enough to be obvious. My heart was steady, not racing, not trembling, just certain. I locked the filing cabinet and returned the key to its envelope, pressing the adhesive strip back into place the way Edward had shown me years ago. Details matter, he used to say. In the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself. Silver hair pulled neatly back. Pearl earrings I have worn every Thanksgiving since Daniel was born. I did not look like a burden. I looked like a woman who has paid every bill on time for 4 decades. I stepped back toward the living room, the folder resting against my side like a quiet reminder. Their voices softened when they saw me approaching, the way people do when they believe a conversation does not concern the person entering the room. Daniel glanced up first. "Everything okay, Mom?" he asked, polite but distracted. I smiled gently and nodded. "Everything is fine," I said. And for the first time that evening, it was true. I returned to the living room with the same measured steps I had used all evening, the folder resting quietly against my side beneath the knit of my sweater. The fire in the fireplace had burned lower, casting a softer glow across the room. Daniel was leaning forward on the couch, elbows on his knees, explaining something about interest rates and timing. Olivia sat beside him, her posture composed, her fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee I had poured for her only minutes earlier. They both looked up when I entered, their expressions shifting into something polite and rehearsed. I lowered myself into the armchair again and crossed my ankles neatly. For a moment, I simply listened. "If we make a move before summer," Daniel said, "we could avoid another year of property taxes at this level." I tilted my head slightly. "Property taxes at this level?" I repeated, my tone calm, curious. He nodded. "They have gone up almost 12% since last year." I folded my hands in my lap. "Yes," I said gently. "I paid them in September." Silence followed, brief but noticeable. Olivia offered a small smile. "Of course you did," she replied quickly. "We just mean long-term planning." Long-term planning. I studied their faces carefully. There was no cruelty there, not in the obvious sense. There was calculation. There was assumption. They believed they were being practical. They believed they were solving a problem. And in their version of the future, I was the variable that needed adjustment. I reached into my sweater pocket and felt the edge of the folder, smooth and firm. I did not remove it yet. Instead, I looked around the room slowly, letting my gaze rest on the familiar details. The bookshelf Edward built from oak planks purchased at a hardware store 30 miles away because he insisted on better quality. The brass lamp we found at an estate sale the year Daniel left for college. The faint scratch on the coffee table from when a toy truck skidded across it decades ago. This house has held a lot, I said softly. Daniel shifted in his seat. We know, Mom. That is why we want to make sure it is handled responsibly. Handled. I nodded once, as if considering his words seriously. You are right, I said. It should be handled responsibly. I leaned forward slightly and placed the folder on the coffee table between us. The sound of paper against wood was subtle but final. Olivia's eyes flicked downward first, then back to my face. What is that? She asked. I did not rush. I opened the folder carefully, smoothing the top page with my palm. This, I said, is the deed to this house. Daniel blinked, confusion crossing his features. The deed, he repeated. I turned the document so it faced them, the printed text clear under the lamplight. Your father transferred full ownership to me 6 months before he passed. I continued, my voice even. It is recorded with the county. The house is solely in my name. The room grew very still. Even the faint crackle of the fireplace seemed to pause. Daniel leaned forward, scanning the page, his forehead tightening as he read. Olivia's posture changed almost imperceptibly, her shoulders drawing back, her expression recalculating. I did not know, Daniel said quietly. I met his eyes. I did not either, I replied. Until tonight. I closed the folder gently, but left it on the table. You spoke about listing the property. I continued, my tone steady. About renovations. About assisted living. I allowed a small pause, not dramatic, simply deliberate. Before any of that is planned, it is important to understand that this house is not an asset waiting to be divided. It is my home. No anger colored my voice. No accusation. Only clarity. Olivia inhaled slowly. Margaret, we were only thinking about what is best. I nodded. And so am I. I leaned back into the armchair, folding my hands once more. Practicality goes both ways. The words settled between us. Not sharp, not loud, but immovable. For the first time that evening, I was not being discussed. I was being heard. Daniel read the document twice before setting it back on the table, his fingers lingering on the edge as if the paper itself might change if he looked long enough. Olivia did not reach for it again. She sat very still, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. The fire continued its quiet crackle, steady and unconcerned with ownership or future plans. Dad never mentioned this, Daniel said finally, his voice lower than before. I nodded gently. He did not mention it to me either, I replied. He simply said everything was handled. I let that settle. The truth did not need decoration. It stood on its own. Daniel leaned back against the couch cushions, running a hand slowly over his jaw. We were not trying to push you out, he said. We were thinking long term. What happens if you fall? If something goes wrong? I folded my hands together, feeling the warmth of my own palms. If something goes wrong, I said evenly, I will make a decision then. Not before. Olivia shifted slightly, crossing her legs the other direction. It is just a lot for one person, she repeated. The yard alone. Takes hours. I allowed myself a small smile. It takes me about 45 minutes with the riding mower, I said. Less if the grass is dry. Daniel gave a faint, uncertain laugh, as if he had forgotten that I still handled these things myself. I watched the two of them carefully. They were not villains. They were comfortable. Comfortable with the idea that time would quietly transfer control to them without conversation. Comfortable believing that age automatically meant surrender. I understand wanting security, I continued. But security does not require displacement. The room grew quieter. Outside, a car door shut somewhere down the street, followed by the distant sound of neighbors laughing as they carried leftovers home. Thanksgiving in this neighborhood has always been predictable. Lights glowing warmly in windows. The smell of roasted turkey drifting through cool November air. Families believing they understand one another. Daniel looked at the framed photograph above the mantel, the one of him at 10 years old holding a wooden bat nearly too big for his hands. We thought you would want to be closer to us, he said softly. Maybe in a smaller place. Something easier. I studied him for a moment. I am already close to you, I replied. You are sitting in my living room. The words were not sharp. They were factual. Olivia inhaled slowly. So what are you saying? She asked. I met her gaze directly. I am saying that there will be no listing in the spring. No renovation plans decided without me. No discussions about my future that assume I am not part of it. I paused briefly, allowing the weight of each statement to settle naturally. If we are planning long-term, we will do it honestly. And we will do it with respect. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that. The shift in the room was subtle but unmistakable. The conversation had moved from strategy to accountability. I reached forward and closed the folder completely, sliding it back toward myself. This house was built on partnership, I said quietly. Your father and I made every decision together. That does not change simply because he is gone. I stood carefully, smoothing the front of my sweater. If you are worried about maintenance, we can discuss hiring help for the heavier work, I added. If you are worried about my health, we can schedule regular checkups and talk openly about plans should something change. I looked at both of them in turn. But I will not be treated as if I am temporary here. The firelight reflected softly against the glass of the framed photographs, catching silver strands in my hair. Daniel exhaled slowly. We understand, he said at last. And for the first time that evening, it did not sound like reassurance. It sounded like recognition. Daniel and Olivia stayed another hour, but the tone of the evening never returned to what it had been before dinner. The air felt clearer, not warmer, simply honest. We moved back to the dining table for pie, and this time no one discussed market trends or square footage. I sliced the pumpkin pie evenly, the knife gliding through the filling I had made from scratch that morning, measuring each teaspoon of cinnamon and nutmeg the way my mother once taught me. Olivia complimented the crust. Daniel asked if I still used the same recipe. I answered calmly, the way I always do, but something had shifted beneath the surface. They were no longer speaking over me. They were speaking to me. When the plates were empty and the dishwasher hummed quietly in the kitchen, Daniel stood and cleared his throat. We should get going, he said. It is a long drive back. They live 40 minutes away, close enough to visit weekly, far enough to feel separate. I walked them to the front door, the hardwood floors cool beneath my feet. Olivia wrapped her coat tightly around herself and hesitated for a moment. We did not mean to upset you, she said, her voice softer now, less certain. I held the door open and looked at her steadily. I was not upset, I replied. I was listening. Daniel leaned down and kissed my cheek, something he has done every Thanksgiving since he was a teenager. We will talk more soon, he said. I nodded. Yes, I answered. We will. The porch light cast a pale glow over the driveway as they walked to their car. I stood there until the engine started and the headlights swept across the front yard, illuminating the maple tree Edward and I planted when Daniel was 8 years old. The leaves had nearly all fallen now, scattered across the grass in thin golden layers. When their car disappeared down the street, the neighborhood returned to its quiet rhythm. I closed the door gently and locked it, sliding the bolt into place with a calm, deliberate motion. The house felt larger once they were gone. Not emptier, just settled. I turned off the lights in the dining room and carried the remaining pie into the kitchen, wrapping it carefully in foil before placing it in the refrigerator. The clock above the stove read 9:15. I poured myself a small cup of coffee and carried it into the living room, lowering myself into Edward's armchair. The folder rested on the side table beside me, exactly where I had placed it after our conversation. I did not open it again. I did not need to. Ownership does not require constant proof. It requires understanding. I looked around the room slowly, noticing details I had nearly taken for granted. The slight dip in the couch cushion where Daniel always sits. The faint scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. The framed photograph of Edward smiling beside the grill, wearing that same navy blazer he insisted on keeping even when it grew too tight across the shoulders. Everything is handled, he had said. Tonight, I finally understood what he meant. He had not been preparing for his absence. He had been protecting my presence. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. Age does not erase authority. It clarifies it. I am 72 years old. I manage my own accounts. I maintain my own property. I decide my own future. The house creaked softly as it cooled, a familiar sound I have heard every night for decades. It is not the sound of a burden. It is the sound of something lived in, cared for, respected. I reached over and turned off the lamp beside me, allowing the room to dim into comfortable shadows. Tomorrow I will rake the remaining leaves if the weather stays dry. I will call the attorney's office to request an updated copy of the deed for my records. Not because I am afraid, but because clarity should be maintained, not assumed. Tonight, however, I will sleep in my own bedroom, under the quilt I stitched by hand, in a house that does not belong to memory or expectation. It belongs to me. The next morning arrived quietly, with pale sunlight slipping through the kitchen blinds and settling across the hardwood floor. I woke before my alarm, as I usually do, and lay still for a moment, listening to the house breathe. The heater clicked on, the pipes shifted softly, and somewhere outside a delivery truck rolled down the street. Nothing felt uncertain. Nothing felt temporary. I dressed slowly, choosing a navy sweater and pressed slacks, the kind of outfit that makes me feel organized even before I have finished my first cup of coffee. After breakfast, I carried the riding mower out from the garage and began clearing the remaining leaves from the front yard. The air was crisp, just under 50 degrees, the kind of late November morning that sharpens the edges of everything. As I worked, I thought about the conversation from the night before. Not with resentment. With perspective. Daniel has always tried to solve problems quickly. Even as a boy, he would rush to stack his blocks higher without checking if the base was steady. Olivia values efficiency. She believes in streamlined decisions and measurable outcomes. I do not fault them for that. What I fault is the assumption that I would quietly step aside to make their plans easier. By the time I finished mowing, a neat line of mulched leaves stretched across the lawn. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, looking at the house from a distance. 2,600 square feet of brick and memory stood solid against the pale sky. The roof was still in good condition. The shutters could use repainting next spring. The porch railing might need tightening before winter fully sets in. These were tasks, not burdens. I parked the mower and went back inside, wiping my shoes carefully on the mat. The house smelled faintly of yesterday's pie and fresh air. At 10 o'clock, I placed a call to Mr. Harris's office. His assistant recognized my name immediately. "Mrs. Whitmore, how are you?" she asked warmly. "I am well," I replied. "I would like to request a certified copy of the deed transfer from 2 years ago for my personal records." She assured me it would be ready by the end of the week. The call lasted less than 3 minutes, but it felt significant. Not defensive, responsible. After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote a short list. Lawn service estimate for heavy seasonal work. Annual health checkup appointment. Review homeowners insurance coverage. None of these were reactions. They were affirmations. If Daniel and Olivia worried about maintenance or unpredictability, I would address those concerns in ways that preserved my independence rather than surrendered it. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A text message from Daniel appeared on the screen. "I have been thinking about last night. I am sorry if we made you feel pushed out." I read it twice before responding. "I appreciate that." I typed carefully. "Let us talk this weekend about practical solutions that work for everyone." I set the phone down without overanalyzing his reply. Apologies do not need to be dissected. They need to be acknowledged. In the afternoon, I walked through each room of the house, not to inspect it, but to inhabit it. I ran my hand along the banister Edward installed when we first moved in. I straightened a framed photograph in the hallway. I opened the window in the guest room slightly to let in fresh air. There is a difference between staying somewhere and belonging somewhere. I do not stay here. I belong here. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the living room floor, I felt something settle within me that had not been there the night before. It was not victory. It was alignment. My life is not an inconvenience to be managed. It is a foundation built over decades. And foundations, when properly laid, do not shift simply because someone else decides it would be easier if they did. Saturday arrived with a steady gray sky and the quiet hum of distant traffic beyond the neighborhood. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee at 8 o'clock and set 3 mugs on the kitchen table instead of 1. Not as a gesture of surrender, but as a gesture of structure. If we were going to discuss practical solutions, we would do it at this table, in this house, with clarity. Daniel and Olivia pulled into the driveway just after 9. I watched from the window for a moment before opening the door. They stepped inside carrying a small box of pastries from a bakery near their home, a polite offering that felt almost ceremonial. "Good morning, Mom," Daniel said, his voice careful but sincere. "Good morning," I replied, stepping aside to let them in. We sat at the kitchen table where I have balanced checkbooks, signed school permission slips, and once helped Daniel fill out his first job application. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines across the table. I poured coffee evenly into each mug and waited. Daniel spoke first. I have been thinking about what you said, he began. About respect. You are right. Olivia nodded slowly. We should have approached it differently, she added. We were looking at numbers and projections. Not at you. I folded my hands loosely around my mug, feeling the warmth steady against my palms. Numbers have their place, I said calmly. But so do people. There was no edge in my voice. Only balance. Daniel glanced toward the window, then back at me. We worry, he admitted. About you being alone here. About unexpected repairs. About health. I nodded once. Those are reasonable concerns, I replied. So let us address them without assuming relocation. I slid the legal pad across the table, the one where I had written my notes earlier in the week. Lawn service estimate for seasonal cleanup. Annual maintenance inspection for the roof and furnace. Scheduled medical checkups. Emergency contact plans. I had even researched a reputable home monitoring system, not because I feel unsafe, but because planning does not diminish independence. It protects it. Olivia leaned forward to read the list. You already looked into these? She asked. Yes, I answered simply. Daniel studied the page carefully. You are serious about staying, he said. I met his gaze without hesitation. I am serious about living, I corrected gently. Here. Silence followed, but it was no longer heavy. It felt constructive. What if, Daniel said slowly, we help with the bigger projects? The ones that require more lifting or climbing. I considered that for a moment. If you are offering help rather than control, I said, I will gladly accept it. Olivia smiled faintly at that. We can schedule a day each month, she suggested. Yard work, minor repairs, anything you need. I nodded. That would be practical. The word no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded collaborative. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling as if releasing something he had been holding all week. I guess we got ahead of ourselves, he admitted. You did, I said, not unkindly. But you are here. Now. I stood and refilled our coffee mugs, the simple rhythm of pouring and passing cups grounding the conversation. I want you both to understand something, I continued. This house is not just a structure. It is a record of our family. I will not leave it because it is convenient for someone else. But I will adapt when it makes sense for me. Olivia nodded slowly. That is fair, she said. And this time, it felt genuine. We talked for another hour about manageable plans, realistic contingencies, and shared responsibilities. No one mentioned listing dates. No one referenced resale value. When they finally stood to leave, Daniel hugged me a little tighter than usual. Thank you for not shutting us out, he said quietly. I rested my hand against his shoulder. Thank you for listening, I replied. After they drove away, I returned to the kitchen table and looked at the 3 empty mugs. Nothing dramatic had happened. No raised voices. No ultimatums. Just a correction, of course. Sometimes power is not about proving ownership. It is about redefining participation. And this time, participation would be on my terms. Winter settled in gradually after that conversation, not with a dramatic storm, but with thin layers of frost that appeared each morning along the edges of the lawn. December arrived with shorter days and longer shadows stretching across the porch Edward built more than 30 years ago. Daniel kept his word. On the second Saturday of the month, he arrived with a toolbox in the back of his truck and a determined look on his face. Olivia followed with a container of homemade soup and a careful smile that felt less rehearsed than before. We spent the morning tightening the porch railing and replacing a loose hinge on the side gate. Daniel climbed the ladder to clear debris from the gutters while I stood below, steadying it with both hands, giving directions when needed. A little more to the left, I called up calmly. There is a cluster near the downspout. He adjusted without argument. There was no tension in the exchange, only cooperation. When we finished, we stood back together and looked at the house from the driveway. The brick exterior glowed softly under the pale winter sun. It did not look like an investment. It looked like continuity. Inside, Olivia warmed the soup on the stove while I set out bowls. The kitchen felt balanced, not crowded. I have been thinking, Olivia said quietly as she stirred, about how quickly we assumed things. I wiped the counter with a clean cloth and considered her words. Assumptions are easy, I replied. They save time, but they cost trust. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. Later, after lunch, Daniel lingered near the hallway where the framed photographs hang in a neat row. He stopped in front of the picture from his high school graduation, the one where Edward's arm is draped proudly across his shoulders. Dad planned ahead, he said softly. I guess he knew we would try to take over. I joined him in the hallway, standing close enough to see the faint crease at the corner of his eyes. Your father planned to protect stability, I corrected gently. Not to prevent you from helping. Just to ensure I was never overlooked. Daniel exhaled slowly. I do not want you to feel overlooked. I looked at him carefully. Then do not overlook me. The simplicity of that seemed to settle something between us. By late afternoon, they gathered their coats and prepared to leave. This time, there was no unspoken agenda in the air. Only routine. We will come by after New Year's Day, Daniel said. Maybe repaint the shutters if the weather holds. I smiled. We will check the forecast, I replied. After their car disappeared down the street, I did not feel the need to sit in silence and reflect. Instead, I walked through the house as I always do before evening, turning off unnecessary lights, adjusting the thermostat by 2 degrees, checking the lock on the back door. The house responded the way it always has, with familiar creaks and steady warmth. I paused in the living room and looked at the spot where the folder had once rested on the coffee table. I no longer needed it within reach. The understanding had already taken root. Being a mother does not mean surrendering authority. Aging does not mean dissolving into the background of someone else's plan. This house stands because it was built with intention. My life stands for the same reason. I moved to the window and looked out at the maple tree, now bare but strong, its branches outlined against the dimming sky. Seasons change, roles evolve, but ownership, when earned and honored, remains steady. And in this house, under this roof, my place is not a temporary arrangement. It is a deliberate choice.